Welcome back, Honors. All right, so great job today in class. I was very, very impressed with y'all's ability to actually throw out some different ideas. You know some stuff about Mesopotamia. Thank you, Mr. Orderson. Thank you for that, and thank you for also, one of you actually knew where Iraq was, which I was mind blown by that. But the big thing about it is, y'all have heard about this culture before, right? You heard about them in 6th or 7th grade, and you probably listened to that goofy song by Mr. Nicky, which is set to Soulja Boy, which is very cringy because that was a song that was out when I was in college. Now, the big thing, though, or actually when I was in high school, the big thing, though, is we in class talked about why would anyone settle there? We talked about, it didn't make much sense that anyone would settle there. We discussed the fact that it was, kind of weird and awkward that, you went out to a desert and then created this place to live, right? So talked about how it was low rainfall, low timber resources, stuff like that. And then we discussed how, the natural levees and things like that actually created this ability to be able to actually live in these areas because irrigation became so massively important. Now, the big thing we're going to talk about, though, also is that we're going to go through the individual Sumerian major states, right? We'll go through the Sumerians and the Akkadians, Sargon the Great, and we'll go through the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, and stuff like that. But we're going to do that at the end of this. But first, what we're going to do is talk about all the commonalities between the Mesopotamian states, right? So all the Mesopotamian states, even though that they were independently ruled on their own, and they all had their own kings and their own governments and their own different ideas and things like that and different customs, Sumerians and Babylonians are not the same people, etc., etc., they did share similar traits, right? Through trade and the movement of products through these different areas, and then also through the sharing of different technological resources, they all had 4 big commonalities. Writing, a common sense of literature, a common style religion, and a common style architecture, right? But the big one that we'll talk about very, very first that all of them shared is the writing system. So the writing system might have changed slightly from city-state to city-state, but writing has taken on a lot of distinctive phases throughout types of history. This is what their writing looked like. Sumerians, Akkadians, and Mesopotamians wrote in a style that looked a lot like this, right? And it's very, very weird, and it's also impossible to translate. We have no idea what this says, but it's still symbolic of the same phases that writing has gone throughout history. So throughout history, writing is you typically have one of 3 different types of writing systems. A pictogram, which is a sign that represents an entire word, kind of like hieroglyphics. An ideogram, which is a sign that represents certain ideas or sounds in the sense of syllables, also known as syllabries, but an ideogram, and then you've got phonetics. And phonetics is what type of alphabet we use now for our writing system. A makes an ah sound, B makes a boo sound. You understand the whole gist, right? Now, we don't know which one of these 3 this system is, but we do know what it's called, okay? So the big reason that you got to actually analyze writing from a larger standpoint, though, is why is this development of writing systems for Mesopotamia so important? Why does it matter that we understand pictograms, ideograms, phonetics, and things like that? It's important to understand the growth of writing because as the natural human development throughout civilization, without the advent of writing, humans would have been stalled and would have been unable to continue to advance. A lot of students, you always ask, why is writing so important? And they're like, oh, to record stuff, oh, to write stuff down. Well, duh. But, to record what? Well, the big thing is, it came along originally as a system of accounting, right? So we don't really know what came first, numbers or letters, but we do know that writing was developed as a system of accounting crops to transmit ideas over great distances and to also codify laws. Now, the codification of laws is not going to come until much later. The biggest one early on was the accounting of crops. And this style of writing that we know was the very first one was known as cuneiform. So cuneiform literally means wedge shape. So if you look at the actual letters and symbols used on this document, or this tablet in a sense, you can see that they all look kind of like little small triangles and kind of like a wedge, right? So that's where we have adopted the word cuneiform for their wedge-shaped style of writing. Now, interestingly enough, too, is how they actually did it. As you can see, the Mesopotamians actually did theirs on stone. But some of y'all might be thinking to yourself, you're like, well, how did they do that and not mess it up? Well, the way they did it is they would actually collect mud from the bottom of rivers and clay from the bottom of rivers, and they would slap it down onto a surface so it splattered out, and then they would write into it and then allow it to dry in the sun, and then bang, I have written something, right? So like that is exactly how the Mesopotamians figured out how to do this. Now the concept of writing would either independently pop up or different civilizations would also create their own writing systems, but these like interesting ideas and different writing systems would spread to Persia and Egypt, and they became a vehicle of growth for the spread of civilization. And it also became the basis for all Mesopotamian writing forms. So the Babylonians had their own kind of spin on cuneiform. The Akkadians had their own spin on it. The Persians may have adopted an Aramaic system that had actually been influenced by the original cuneiform. We don't really know if the Egyptians came up with that hieroglyphics before they ever came into contact with cuneiform, but we definitely do know that the Egyptian style of writing is very, very unique, and it is very different from cuneiform, but there's a possibility that they learned how to adopt writing systems from the Mesopotamians. Now, the big thing about it, though, is how do you decide who learns to read and write? How do you figure that out? Because here's the interesting facet. You have to understand that writing and reading was basically reserved only for the upper echelons. We talked about that in the warm-up today. We talked about how, like, the Neolithic agricultural revolutions could be considered the greatest mistake in all of history because now there's this giant gulf between the wealthy and the wealthy and the poor, or whatever have you. Another thing that became a status symbol was your ability to read and write. You only knew how to read and write because you were educated on how to read and write. And if you were educated, it means you could afford it. And we'll get to that here in a second. The development of cuneiform, though, is directly linked to the establishment of education systems. Because to be able to codify and actually write down a cuneiform system, you had to be taught by somebody who already knew how to do it. Those people were known as scribes. A scribe is a person who copies documents before printing. Now, ironically enough, printing systems didn't exist yet. Printing actually was developed in Southeast Asia by the Koreans and the Chinese as early as 1100 or 900 AD. So the big thing, though, is in this time period, scribes had to be trained on how to actually write inside of those clay pieces, right? You can actually see a little scene right here of 3 masters teaching 4 apprentices how to actually write on those clay tablets before they dry. You also see something in this guy's hand right here. We'll get to that here in a second. But apparently, scribes had to be wealthy and they had to be men, which is sexist and messed up, all right? Because basically the idea was that the elite knew how to write and the wealthiest people knew how to write, and this would reserve them jobs for later on government work. Scribe schools also eventually started teaching a lot of other subjects other than just writing. Now, as this began to progress and grow, basically in the long run, the earliest schools were also developed in Mesopotamia to teach people how to actually read and write, and then also they began to teach them math, botany, literature, and other stuff like that. Scribe training was also really harsh, though. This guy right here standing behind them, as you can see, is hovering over these boys that are trying to practice their writing, okay? Now, if they made a mistake, they would be caned, which actually means to be hit with that stick repeatedly as punishment for messing up their writing. If you arrived late, caning. If you did anything wrong, caning. You actually were physically hit if you didn't write everything correctly. Now, speaking of literature, though, naturally when you move from writing, you usually move into literature. The big thing you got to understand is literature came after this accounting of crops and stuff like that. Writing came first, but the very first fictional stories were then later recorded. Now, I don't mean that the very first time somebody made up a story came after writing. That's very highly doubtful. But there was a large tradition in nomadic communities and Paleolithic communities of storytelling, using cave art and things like that, or some of the cave art that we've actually discovered. The thing about it is, though, is none of these stories were ever written down. So when the Mesopotamians developed their cuneiform writing system, they began to actually develop a method to record these stories that had been shared orally throughout so much time. Now, remember, that means that some of these stories, though, are probably not as close to the original telling of the story as we would like them to be, due to the fact that what happens to stories as they are told by word of mouth over and over again. It's like that telephone game when you were little. I whisper into, I don't know, there's some girls that sit up here. There's a Kayla or something that sits up here. If I whispered into her ear and I was like, oh, everyone gets candy on Tuesday. and then it goes down the line, it's going to get all the way over here to like Jernigan, and Jernigan's going to be like, purple monkey dishwasher. It has no idea what the actual story was originally or what was originally said. The big thing, though, is literature became the basis of Mesopotamian culture. Many of these stories are going to transfer to all Mesopotamian peoples, and the biggest one that became very, very popular in the Mesopotamian area, the Fertile Crescent area, was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, this right here is a stone, recessed carving of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a fictional Sumerian king that became very, very popular and is considered the first epic poem and first work of great literature. It is several volumes long, has many, many different iterations, and Mr. Mathern loves the story. So if you want to bring up something that he'll geek out about, ask him about Gilgamesh. But basically what he was like the Hercules of Mesopotamia, right? So now that you have a writing system, you can create these really, really intense stories. And also, really interestingly enough, his story includes two things that are very important when you're actually analyzing Western civilizations. One, it includes a great flood. So the thing about it, in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the stories that preceded it, the Mesopotamians actually would oftentimes talk about a great flood, right? Now, something very important that you should jot down, I don't know if it's in a later slide, I gotta kind of check that out and see how it goes, but the Mesopotamians kind of lived in fear of flooding all the time. Their floods were untimed, catastrophic, very intense, could wipe out entire towns or farming communities. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is that actually possibly relates to rising sea levels during that time. So something that you need to understand is that every civilization has a flood story. I'm not kidding. Every civilization has a flood story. The Christians have Noah. The Mesopotamians have the creation of the world under, I can never remember what, Ishtar, right? So and they have their creation story uses a flood. The Egyptians have flood mythology using Osiris and Isis. Everybody's got a flood story. Now, interestingly enough, it could be related to the fact that following the Pleistocene era, going into the early thousands BC, the sea levels were rising, which would have caused catastrophic flooding. Because do you see all this green land right here? That is the modern-day country of England and the United Kingdom and also Ireland. This right here is known as Doggerland. That used to be exposed ground. That used to be England used to be connected to the continent of Europe and not separated by the English Channel. But following the Ice Age, the ice caps melted, the sea levels rose, and now England is an island. But we have actually used forensic archaeology to realize that there were small civilizations and communities all in this little different area, and they have discovered some of these artifacts underwater. Now, the interesting thing about that means that these flood stories could be connected to catastrophic flooding that was occurring in their lifetimes. So that makes complete sense as a conduit or way of recording natural events, right? You use them to be fictionalized, and it makes a lot of sense because if these oral traditions were shared over and over again, and the original Mesopotamians experienced catastrophic flooding, things that they were afraid of all the time, then they then put it into their literature. Gilgamesh, though, also comes later in the story following the flood stories. He actually is this really, really cocky, arrogant guy, and we'll talk about him more in class a little bit too, and his friend Enkidu, who's apparently like Bigfoot. Now, the big thing, though, going forward is also their faith and religion is going to become very, very multifaceted and developed. In the Mesopotamian region, whether you were in Acadia, or you're Sumer, or or Babylon, or Neo-Babylon, or even Assyria, the big thing about it is they were all very similar religious styles. Also, they all used a lot of very similar religious art. One, they were all polytheistic, which means they have multiple different gods. In Mesopotamia alone, they had over 3,600 different gods and deities. And you may or may not have heard of a couple of them before. There's one known as Ishtar. Some people have debated that it actually is probably related to the Starbucks symbol. I disagree. That's more than likely a Greek siren. But 3,600 different gods and deities, all representing different natural processes or different ideas or ideals of modern day or everyday life. So they also had very prominent, intense gods. You do not need to write these down. You just need to remember there are a lot of different gods in Mesopotamian religions. Enlil is the supreme god and the god of the air. Ishtar is the goddess I said earlier who gave birth to the world in a great flood. She's the goddess of fertility and life. An is the god of heaven. Enki is the god of water in the underworld. And their big god, also the one that was heavily prayed to, was Shamash, who is the god of the sun and the giver of law. Now, the big thing, though, something you need to understand, is that the position in Mesopotamian culture as your king was also enhanced and supported by religion. Kingship was believed to be created by the gods, and the gods' power was divinely ordained, right? So that means that they believed in this concept that the king was selected to rule by God, as in this idea of divine right to rule. Now, interestingly enough, this will come up again later. When we get into the 1600s in Europe, this concept of divine right to rule pops back up again, but with English and French and Spanish and Russian and like Prussian kings and all these other different figures. Each god had control of certain things, and each city was apparently ruled or had particular gods or deities that they prayed directly to. Now, including all of this stuff, next to this part right here where it says kingship is believed to be created by the gods and the kingly power, put next to that theocracy. Theocracy. A theocracy is basically when your religion and your government are two things that are tied together, okay? So you need to make sure you know that the fact of the matter is that in Mesopotamian culture, they basically had a theocratic style government, depending on whatever place you were in, right? They actually believed that their gods were directly related to their king and giving them advice and ideas on what to do. Now, the other big thing that all the Mesopotamian cultures shared was architecture. They all had a very, very similar architectural style, right? And the biggest thing you could see this in are these things known as ziggurats, right? Ziggurats are prayer temples. They're massive, huge construction of multi-layered prayer temples that were made by just laying mud brick on mud brick on mud brick on mud brick in all these different tiers. Now, this right here is what we believe some of the largest ziggurat was ever made existed. This was in Sumer. The thing crazy about it, though, is that all this stuff on the inside is it's solid, okay? They did not have the ability to construct something this large and have empty space on the inside. Now, there have been theories that there are some like hallways and tunnels and things like that, some very, very small entrances in there. But the main reason why they built this thing is for this large dwelling on the top. Why would you build a building this large? Why would you build it that big? This is the remaining architectural leftovers of that same ziggurat that I actually showed you. Why would you build something that big? Why would you build it that big just for this little tiny little like 3-room house like up on the top of the thing? It's to get closer to their gods, right? To actually attempt to get as close as possible to their gods when they prayed so it would be heard. But inside that thing was a room for offerings and food goods. Famous ziggurats, though, may have been believed, like this guy, may have inspired the Tower of Babel story from the Old Testament. Now, you have to understand, you don't know this yet, but we will talk about this later. The ancient Jews are very, very closely linked to the Mesopotamian region and culture because we believe that they actually broke off from a group known as the Amorites or possibly the Hyksos and created their own culture known as the, of course, like Jewish faith or the Hebrew culture or the Israelites or the Canaanites or whatever you want to call them. They created this idea and it is believed that they used the Tower of Babel story to basically say that the Mesopotamians were defying God by trying to get too close to him, and that then later accounted for all the different languages and stuff like that. Now, the gifts from each individual major city-state is really important. So now what we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything up real quick, and we're going to talk about each individual Mesopotamian city-state and the big things that they did. Or we're going to talk about two big ones, and then we'll bring up a couple ones in class. Now, the Sumerians were really, really big for a long time, and they also contributed different writing styles, different systems, and stuff like that. They developed cuneiform. They created the wheel. They were the first ones, though, to use irrigation more than anything else to grow barley, wheat, dates, etc. They created a system of dikes, dams, and canals, and ditches, and other things like that to make their irrigation systems possible, like what we talked about in class today. The big thing, though, also, is they were the first ones to lay the foundation for Mesopotamian society. They developed cuneiform. They created the very first wheel. And then also, as an advent, there was a city that they created off the side known as the Royal Tombs of Ur. So apparently, we have a lot of Mesopotamian research for the Sumerians. There's a ton of stuff we have found, artifacts-wise, that have given us a glimpse into Sumerian life and the way that they actually constructed and did things, right? These two things actually were found inside of this massive tomb in the city known as right? So literally it's called Now, the big thing about it, though, is that the tombs of were constructed for a leader of that city in the Sumerian kingdom when it was at one of its largest points. And it was found with not only different items from Sumerian culture, different artworks from Sumerian culture, some copies of different writing systems that we actually use to like document and study the Sumerians, but inside the tombs of they also found a bunch of remains of dead people. And they believe that there's a chance that the king or the leader of died, and then a bunch of Sumerians then had to kill themselves and like drink poison and stuff, and all died with him, which is really, really aggressive, very aggressive. Now, the big thing, though, also going forward is we also have the Akkadians. Now, the Sumerians are really important because they created all the early stuff whenever you're talking about Mesopotamia, wheel, cuneiform, all that. The Akkadians were around for like 8 seconds. So they were led by this guy named Sargon the Great, and the thing about him is he was the very first one to create like a really large military structure. So Sargon the Great, as seen right here, this is believed to be his portrait / death mask. The big thing about him is he basically conquered Sumeria using a very large military. He created an infrastructure of roads. Apparently, he made the very first postal service, which is very, very important and very, very impressive. You got to be able to send mail. Mail's very important. He also created an infrastructure of he was also very short-lived because they fell to invading tribes. They only lasted about 200 years, right? And so we're going to stop there, all right? And then we're going to come back to the Mesopotamians in class before we get into the Egyptians and talk about them a little bit more. But what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to talk about the Babylonians, Hammurabi and his code and some different things like that. But I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a great one.